All right. Boy, I'm struggling with my microphone situation here. But I tried this one out a couple times and it seemed to work, so we'll give it a go. This is I'd like to explain the interactions that I have had with mental health institutions and what they solve or what they appear to solve and the problems that I have encountered interacting with them. Um, First time I was ever locked up in a mental institution, I was 15 years old. Had gotten in a huge fight with my parents because they disagreed with a particular romantic entanglement that I had been involved in high school, and they started monitoring all of my communications and um, yeah, that was not on the one hand a level of monitoring that I was comfortable with as a 15-year-old boy, or used to because I didn't live with them. And also, I'm pretty sure that my parents in California were probably entirely aware of the extent of that particular romantic involvement, and they figured they ought to just let teenagers be teenagers. So there's a difference in parenting philosophy. Um, and my mother and my stepfather had told me that they were not going to let me go back to California. I was only supposed to be there for 6 weeks, and then they were gonna change that and see if they could keep me in Virginia. And I didn't want that because I wanted to go and be with my friends, and go back to high school. I didn't want to be homeschooled and stuck in Virginia. Um, and so I became suicidal. Um, and I mean, suicidal ideation has been a long road for me. For me, it's sort of an ever-present specter. Um, and if you're not a person who can relate to having suicidal ideation, I might argue that things have not been bad enough for you yet. Um, and to some degree, I don't trust people who can't relate to that feeling. Um, because this is an awful place that we live in sometimes. Uh, and even if it appears on the surface that everything is fine with someone, their internal experience may differ from yours. Um, they may not experience pleasure or happiness on a regular basis at all, and may have no hope of experiencing pleasure or happiness in their lives. And some of those people are right. Um, but in any case, I was a 15-year-old boy, and I was upset because they weren't going to let me go be with my girlfriend again. And I saw my whole life collapsing around me, and I became suicidal. I freaked out and told my mom that I was suicidal. That was the first time that I ever told her I was suicidal. And so their response was to have me put into a mental health facility, which is not an unreasonable response if you are a person who does not know how to handle a person who is experiencing suicidal ideation. Because what options are you left with at that point? I'm not unsympathetic to the plight. If you are stuck around a person who seems like they might be a danger to themselves and others, then you might reach for tools, whatever those tools may be, to try to resolve the situation, especially if you're a concerned parent. Um, unfortunately, the tools that we have at our disposal either fall short or tend to cause more harm than they do good. Uh, yeah, it's a temporary problem for something that needs a permanent solution or a more permanent one if those problems persist. But for me, they were incidental at the time. Um, if I get into the rest of my history of my life, you might capture why depression was a specter for me at the time. Um, but I was increasingly distressed, and they had me locked up about it. And in that particular instance, I was locked up as a 15-year-old boy with, I think, 8 suicidal girls who all thought I was pretty neat. And it was just me and them in movies all day long. Um, so it was certainly a nice little break from the stress of dealing with the threats from my parents and concern about what was going to happen to me and whether or not I'd ever go back home. Um, and I don't remember what they did for me there. I don't know that they put me on any medication in that particular institution, but I mean, all we did all day was do arts and crafts, and there was some educational material about how to deal with depression and how to manage your emotions, which is something that a 15-year-old boy might be struggling with anyway. Um, and then my dad came and got me out. Uh, at which point it's fair to say that I was no longer suicidal because my dad came and got me out. So he was going to take me home, which was what I wanted. Um, the second time I was institutionalized was in Camp Pendleton at the Naval Hospital Great Lakes, or Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton, sorry. Um, Balboa was the name of it. And what had led up to that was, again, suicidal ideation. Now, I'm trying not to get too far into all of my experiences in the military, but very foundationally, um, I had been getting into trouble with my chain of command to start with. I was very concerned about my grandmother who was living in Los Angeles, and it didn't feel to me like anybody was looking after her, and I was homesick. And it was a 4.5 hour drive. So I started driving back and forth every day. And then I was late to work. And being late in the military is not looked kindly upon, especially if it happens on a continual basis. So they were punishing me a whole bunch about it. At some point, they tried to bar me from leaving the base. And they were just playing games. I mean, that's what they do in the military when you mess up, is they start playing games with you and making your life miserable. Um, sort of an unspoken understanding of what's going to happen is if you create problems for your chain of command, they're going to create problems for you. Um, suppose the smart thing for me at the time would have been to stick with the program and stay on base and ignore my ailing grandmother. but I still think I did the right thing. Um, the right thing. Or at least I can forgive myself now for doing the wrong thing if that's what I did. Um, so, in the middle of all of that, I got into a tactical combat casualty course, I believe, and it's a week long course. You show up for like a couple hours every day, and they teach you. I mean, they just kind of flog you a little bit, but they do like you get a little bit of training in body carries and working in full gear. And I mean, anytime you do that is a little bit more experience. It's good. Um, but this particular trainer was. I always go back to the boots. See, in the military, they they tend to run in boots. Okay, you go out for a march or something, and you're getting ready to go for a run. Sometimes they'll make you do it in boots, and the idea is to train like you fight. Seems reasonable enough. The problem is that's terrible for your back and knees, and you probably shouldn't do it at all. But you definitely shouldn't do it very much. But some commanders are of the philosophy that you must always train like you fight, which is why at the end of a long career, you'll see a lot of guys come out with back and knee problems. And there are strictures, there are rules within naval commands at least to prevent you from having to run in your boots. And those rules tend to be ignored. So I'm trying to describe the mentality of the training regiment that I was in because this guy, it was a hoorah, go getter. We're gonna mess you up. Um, we're gonna throw crazy training regiments at you, and you know whether or not they're appropriate for people is beside the point. We train like we fight. You got to be prepared for anything. I don't. It's hard for me to say. Um, After having gone through all of that um, and developed a personal philosophy about, I think that we should be training fewer people to respond to the world around them with swiftness and violence, and we should be training more people to take care of other people. Because when you train a bunch of people to respond to everything around them with swiftness and violence, then you have a bunch of people out in society who will autonomically respond to things with swiftness and violence. Um, and that's not good for anybody involved unless you're trying to hurt some people. So, well, the Marine Corps is generally trying to hurt some people. Um, and I guess that also includes us sometimes under the philosophy that you're training, anyway. So, um, I was doing a body carry and I was doing one, yeah, I was carrying somebody and I was in full gear. So, I mean, I must have been carrying 300 pounds in total on my frame. And I leaned wrong and I felt my back unzip. And I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that I was in a lot of pain and I really didn't want to be carrying anything or doing anything at all. And I expressed this to my instructor and laid down on the floor. And everybody, he called my chain of command. My chain of command convinced him that I was just a big whiner because of their preconceived notions about me, because of my tardiness. Um, and yeah, I was not the most well decorated or well-reputed sailor in my command for certain. Um, Although I started out that way, I was top of my class, and I'm getting too far into the weeds. I worked in a department that was far over my head. So when they moved me back down with the riffraff, I kind of didn't want to be there anymore. And I was already very burnt out with the military to begin with, because of some of the experiences that I had overseas and starting to recognize what our role was. I've always made the argument that people who don't see how everything works get along much better in the military, because you can just turn off your brain and have faith. And I was never a person who could do that very well. Anyway, so there I was, writhing in pain. And he called my chain of command, and they convinced him that I was a faker. And so that was sort of how I carried on for several weeks until I got an appointment. Because I saw a doctor pretty early on, like almost immediately. And they said they ordered an MRI. And the MRI took 3 months. But in the meantime, I kept going back for physical therapy and things like that. Um, but I was in excruciating pain, 24 hours a day. It never stopped. Eventually, when I got the MRI done, they discovered a slipped disc that was occluding a nerve in my spine. Um, so that really explained everything that was happening to me, because it was positional. It was right in my lower back. It was sending pain signals to my toes. The way I would describe it is it felt like somebody was pulling the nerve endings out of my feet, um, or just the one foot. And I, I mean, I drank the pain away a little bit, but needless to say, the rest of my career suffered as a result. And because of the reputation that I had developed already, my chain of command, even after I brought them the MRI to show them physical proof of what was causing me to be in pain, they treated me like I was faking it. And they made me run. And because I worked in medicine, all of my doctors were within reach of my chain of command. And so they had seen and heard rumors about me already. Um, I think I did bring a cane in with at some point, but I got too embarrassed to use it because I could tell everybody thought that I was just using it as a prop. And then I started dragging my leg around because it hurt less to drag it than it did to lift it. And I could tell that they thought that I was just faking that too. So I became very depressed and suicidal. And I expressed this to my chain of command. And their response was to bring a chaplain in. And from their perspective, it maybe felt like an informative piece. And from mine, it felt more like a humiliation ritual, which probably half and half. Um, and I don't remember how, but eventually they did have me institutionalized for a little while. And I was so happy to just have the break for a little while, to not have anybody yelling at me or have any expectations of me, and to be able to sit with my pain and try to stretch or try different things with it to see if it would hurt less. But that's almost worse sometimes too, because if you sit with nothing else to do and pain in your body, it's hard to focus on anything else. that particular trip to the psych ward was um, uneventful, uninteresting. I don't even remember. I think that they did prescribe me some antidepressants there, and we tried some, and I don't remember it being remarkable in any way. Obviously, the medication didn't stick, or I probably had a negative side effect. That's oh, and I skipped over one um, because there was another one before that when I was 19, and again suicidal ideation, which I've been living with my father, and my grandmother had moved out of the house, and my father was attempting to pick up a role as you know as my guardian and to direct me in a paternal way. And because we had not established that kind of relationship up to that point, uh, I did not take to that very well. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but I came to feel as though I was unwelcome in the house and I ought to leave. And so I took the truck and I left. Um, and I went to stay with a friend, but I had been struggling a lot up until that point with depression and task initiation and dysfunction, which is what my father was trying to correct in me. But that's not the kind of thing you can yell out of a person. So I don't know what you're supposed to do as a paternal figure for somebody dealing with the conditions that I was dealing with, but I've never been able to figure that out to begin with. I am my own problem, and I've been spending a lifetime seeking a solution for it. Anyway, at this point, when I was 19 and my dad and I got into this fight, I wound up leaving the house. And then, because of the stress of all that and my general feeling that I needed help from somebody somewhere, I checked myself into a mental institution because I was suicidal. Um, and as I said, this is sort of an ever present specter for me. Um, being suicidal, or at least being aware that I really don't want to be stuck here feeling like this all the time, and I don't see any way to escape it, is a constant for me. Um, but it's one that I've come to accept and just live with. It's uncomfortable living with it, but I can't get rid of it. So, uh, and if you're a person who thinks that that means that I ought to be locked up until I am no longer suicidal, um, well, let me get a little further into this discussion. Uh, so the one that I went to when I was 19 was the more interesting of the three. And what I recall of it is, I mean, you go into the place, they strip you down, they check all of you in a way that is to some degree invasive and humiliating, and then you are locked inside. Um, and I believe in most places, so long as you meet the criteria to be locked inside of one of these places, they will not let you out until you have been cleared by a psychiatrist. Um, I met a few people in there, a few characters. There was a man, there was nothing wrong with him. He may have been suicidal, but he made it very clear and apparent to me that most of the reason that he was in that institution was because he didn't have any other place to stay. So for him, the game was figuring out how to get them to keep him for as long as possible. Um, and the staff there know this. They have an awareness that there are those people and that they will have to, I don't know, trick them into admitting that that's what they're doing so that they aren't using up resources that could otherwise be used for other people. And then that's another thing about these institutions is that they are always, or at least in this country, historically understaffed. Um, so there's always a feeling of being a burden to a system when you are inside of that system. Um, and then there were a few just, sort of, there was one girl who she just was suicidal and she really trusted the system and she checked herself in and she did get herself on some medication and I got her phone number and I wound up talking with her later and she stayed on that medication and it worked for her. And that was her entire experience with it. Um, most of the people that I met in there seemed to be either close to vagrancy or certainly had been homeless, many of them probably in prison at some point. Um, and these are the ones that are institutionalized and seeking solutions to problems that they have. Sometimes those problems are just housing and food. Um, and sometimes they have very serious mental health problems, like the young lady who was clearly very manic. And I've watched her sort of devolve into a paranoid, delusional state. And at first she was very bubbly and she would hang out with everybody. And clearly she had come in off the street and she was very happy to be there with everyone. Very, very, confident and amiable. And then she started hiding in corners and she wouldn't talk to anybody. Um, and this was now for my personal experience there. Uh, they pretty quickly started me on antipsychotics. Um, so like I said, I had checked in there complaining of suicidal ideation and looking for a solution to all of these longstanding problems, these longstanding mental health problems that I have. And again, I was 19 years old, so this is where it all started. I mean, not really. My life contributed, uh, but this is where no, because I had been in I'd been through therapy and I'd been to a number of psychiatrists up to that point trying to treat a long-standing depression and anxiety and ADHD, um, to little or no effect sometimes, with the exception of yeah, the short time that I was taking Adderall when I was younger. Um, but I wasn't doing anything particularly useful while I was taking it, and I don't think that I ever reached a point of stability where I was being like a functional member of society. Um, anyway, in this mental health institution, they put me on antipsychotics, and I still can't really make sense of why, but it caused a condition called akathisia. And I have gone on and tried to describe this for people, but I have had my entire body broken in a car accident while being locked up in prison, and with no pain medication. and terrified that I was going to be locked in prison for the rest of my life. Um, and terrified that I might not ever walk again. And I will still swear to you up and down, being stuck with akathisia was the worst nightmare. Um, and I've got my guesses about why. I think it something about the way it messes with your dopamine receptors. And for me, it caused an inability to feel comfortable without movement. But movement doesn't uh, doesn't help. So this discomfort drives me to move, but even the moving doesn't cure the discomfort. But I am still driven by this constant sense that moving might help me feel better. So I can't sit still. And so much of it is happening like not on the conscious level that it's just discomfort. It just feels awful and miserable. And then, of course, because I can't move or I can't stop moving, my muscles get exhausted. So now my whole body hurts. My feet are blistered. I can't stop twitching and moving all of my muscles, and they're all sore. Um, I guess it's a good way to get in shape real quick, but it's really awful to live in a body that feels that way. And I tolerated that because I was trying to go along with the program. And after being stuck in there for a long period of time, and that's the other thing is that while you're inside, they give you access to usually some kind of prescriptive medication that will calm you down. Because it's almost a standard philosophy within these psychiatric institutions to have on hand and available at request every few hours within a reasonable regimen some kind of calming medication. Um, but they will not prescribe that medication to you once you leave the facility. So if that's what you were using to regulate, I guess you're doing it wrong. Um, but I do remember feeling as though I would stabilize eventually because he kept telling me, well, so long as you stay on this medication for longer, it will normalize in your system and you will start to feel better. And I took him at his word and I tried to stay on that medication. I'm going to tell you that even one day with akathisia is hell. 3 weeks with akathisia, but I tried because I believed in the institution and I believed in the expertise of the psychiatrist. Um, so after a few weeks, he cleared me and I checked myself out. And then after about, I don't think it was maybe a few days without access to Ativan, I decided that this was not, I mean, I became suicidal again because I at that time would have much rather have been dead than to have to feel that way 24 hours a day. Just anything that will end the discomfort, please. This is an awful nightmare. So I checked myself back in to the mental health facility. And he told me to just keep taking that medication and just wait. And that was the point at which I decided that, because I asked him to take me off of it and put me on something else because this was intolerable. And he told me no. Um, so I figured, as much as I had been struggling with depression and anxiety before, that was certainly a more comfortable state than the one that I was trapped in. So I lied. Um, I don't remember what I did or how I did it. And I do remember going back and forth in my own head as to whether or not I was trying to stick with the program, but I certainly had my doubts at that point. Um, so I didn't know what to do, but all I could feel was that this institution was hostile. They were going to require me to continue to be this uncomfortable. They weren't going to do anything about that problem. And I knew what to do about that problem. Stop taking that medication. Um, so I got out, and then I spent several days very, very, very uncomfortable as that medication flushed out of my system, Abilify. That was my first interaction with antipsychotics. Um, and I swore up and down I would never let them put me on that drug again because I thought it was the only one. Um, I suppose I don't know why none of these have ever been suggested on an outpatient basis for me, but I guess we're about to find out because I'm about to start taking Caplyta. Um, in any case, my distrust of these institutions started there. Now, because I've been struggling with all of this stuff for most of my life, I've spent a lot of my life studying these things and very interested whenever anyone had to tell a story about being in a mental health ward or struggling with their own mental health problems. I spent a lot of time listening to people talk about those things and about depression in general, suicidal ideation, brain problems, ADHD, PTSD. Um, it's an awful lot of introspection, and I would vacillate on whether or not it is helpful to engage in that as a person with mental health issues, because then you start to see more of them in yourself. You get to be too introspective and aware of your own internal, and then all you see are the problems that you're having. Uh, so that was my second experience. And then I joined the Navy after that. And then my third experience with suicidal ideation was, again, at the end of my tenure. And yeah, the next time that I had a mental health episode, they put me in prison for 3.5 years. Um, if you consider the iconography of mental health institutions as they are projected in culture, I have a hard time understanding why anyone would have any expectation that these institutions know what they're doing and are going to help. It seems to me that what these institutions are for, and I think that even this is within their own creed, is if a person is a danger to themselves or others, you can have them locked into one of these places and hopefully treated in a very quick and triage style situation until they can seek outpatient care. But you wind up working with a doctor who does not have a contextual understanding of your conditions, who is working in an under-resourced and understaffed environment, who is working with a lot of people who are there only partially because they need their mental health concerns met, because there are other people who are leaning on these institutions because they are going hungry and homeless. So it builds a sense of distrust. And then you have a lot of people inside these institutions to interact with who have poor coping mechanisms for you to learn. Isn't that great? Or for you to be traumatized by. Um, Everybody knows about the straitjackets and the rubber rooms, and we pretend that we don't do that anymore and we're more civilized. Um, that is an appearance only. As much as I'll try and sit here and describe for you what my experiences were like and why I would believe that, you can't really experience it unless you experience it. If you've never been, I've never gone hungry. Not really. I've never been starving. I've been very hungry. I've been concerned that I won't have enough food, but I've never gotten to a point where I knew that I was starving. I don't know what that feels like. Neither do most of you. If you've never been confined, you can't know what it feels like to be confined, to have your agency removed from you in that way. Um, and I have a personal experience with confinement as a measure of punishment. Um, and because the prison institutions explicitly view themselves as a measure of doling out punishment, the staff within those institutions treat themselves as people who ought to be doling out punishment in whatever capacity they can. Um, they might say otherwise, but my experience is I have met good cops. I met good COs and I met people within these mental institutions who really do care. They really do mean to be doing good for the people around them. And I hope that they never figure out that they're wrong. Not if they can't do anything about it, at least. I would almost rather them not be assuaged of that delusion because without proper funding, these institutions are a very bad triage stopgap. They're built just to stabilize people well enough that they are not considered suicidal or homicidal. And they're not even very good at that. Because once you get stuck inside of one and you discover that there is this underlying suspicion and hostility toward you as a patient, um, it's not helpful. It's helpful for everyone else because they don't have to worry about you anymore. But otherwise, it is just traumatic for the person who you are ostensibly trying to treat. Now, this most recent venture into the mental health system started when my stepfather called the police. Um, no, I would not have considered myself suicidal, homicidal, or a danger to myself or others at the time that he had called the police, which is what I told them and what I told the mental health people at the hospital. I was very angry, but I had no aim to hurt anyone. And I was very hurt and disillusioned with yeah. But the second time that they had me locked up, I did feel like I needed it. Um, and I would like to get into some of the specifics of my experiences there, if not just to put them down, but then also to explain this the cost and benefit here. So they checked me in, um, and their immediate supposition was bipolar with a manic episode, and maybe some schizophrenia because of the delusions that I had been having. Um, I don't know. I don't know about manic depression with me. If it is manic depression, comes in broad strokes. Um, Often I have a hard time arguing that the intensity of the emotions that I personally feel aren't just related to, you know, my life has been traumatic. I've got a whole bunch of PTSD from the things that I've been through. Um, so I tend to amp up pretty easily. It doesn't take much to dump a whole bunch of adrenaline into my body. Um, and that is and the events of my life have been bipolar. I've gone through periods of incredible triumph and overcoming things that most people wouldn't even consider trying to overcome. Um, and I've done things that I think people would be astounded to see themselves doing, or at least I was. And I've had awful tragedy. I lost my daughters. They're not dead, they were taken from me. Um, and that experience that I had in the service was pretty bad, and some of the experiences I had trying to take care of my grandma, who is a difficult person, and then as my stepfather is also a very difficult person. Um, Most of the things I've been through, I wouldn't argue were all that bad. Um, so I almost feel like I don't deserve any. I mean, it doesn't feel special to me. Like We get stories out of Palestine all the time. People losing their whole families, getting their arms and legs blown off, and that's every day, right? And here I am struggling in a different kind of hell, but I couldn't argue that it's worse than that. And there are plenty of people in this country who struggle in hells that are far worse than I have experienced, but I've had it pretty bad a few times. Um, Sort of forgot where I was going with all this. All right. I'll come back and I'll do another one that is explicitly about my experience in this most recent mental health institution. And I'll leave all that there.